Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before opening this session, I just would like to introduce myself and this organization called USJI. I'm an operating advisor of USJI, Yoshiaki Abe, and I'm going to serve as a coordinator of today's session. USJI was established in April 2009 as an American NPO registered in Washington, D.C. The unique thing of USJI, United States Japan Research Institute, is that itself was organized by 5 Japanese competing universities. And of course, I was not there when they signed the agreement, but they decided to increase the volume of loudspeaker on what 5 universities are doing, and what Japan is doing. And part of that effort, we are running scheduled seminars in autumn and in spring, and spring session is coming. And every now and then, we have this kind of interesting seminar when we can organize. And we are going to have a 90-minute session. We have 3 speakers here, Mr. Caruso, Professor Ito, and Mr. Spencer. And everyone has 15 minutes to speak. And then we have 2 commentators, Ms. Nakano and Mr. Tago, Professor Tago. And I would like to open the session to all of you to give us interesting and difficult comment and questions. And I would like to open the session. And first speaker I'm going to ask is Mr. Caruso. Let's have a hand for Mr.
Caruso. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for braving the kind of inclement weather, and it's really great to be part of this panel. Dr. Abe, thank you very much for chairing this session, and I'm going to provide a broad overview of the energy security landscape and how that's been changing. And I have a number of slides. I'll probably go over some of them pretty quickly, but they'd be available to USJI and any of you who would like them afterwards. So let me get right into it, because what I want to do is take us back a bit to when energy security really was high on the priority list, and that comes right after the embargo of 73, 74, formation of the IEA. And Japan played a critical role, as it continues to do now, in making energy security high on the priority list for coordinated energy policy. And that then, as now, is because Japan is such an important player in the global energy markets. And certainly this tragedy of Fukushima has heightened that intensity. Most important when one looks out at what the changing landscape for energy security is and will be, I think, is on the investment side. We are now in the period, global oil in particular, where enormous new investment will be needed over the next 20 to 30 years, which is true for all forms of energy, including the ones we'll talk about more in depth by other speakers. And the other major shift has been the movement eastward in global oil and energy demand, namely China and India. And I'll show you the latest estimates on that. However, the resources to meet this demand continue to be mainly Middle East and North Africa. And we see the instability that continues to raise its head there in Iran most recently, but North Africa continuing most of last year. Why? It's because that's the cheapest resources, and I'll show you that. Developing those resources through investment will be affected by much more in the future than in the past by resource nationalism and the importance of national oil companies. We've heard a lot about the Strait of Hormuz in the last week or two, the choke points that could potentially disrupt oil and maybe even gas supplies continue to be critically important, and why energy security plays such a big role. And that has led to volatility in prices recently and over time, and we don't see that changing much. There is some good news in what otherwise sounds like a pretty bleak picture, and that is the discovery and development and application of new technology and unconventional oil and gas resources is changing the picture in North America and will change the picture globally, I believe, over the next 10 to 20 years. This is just an example of how volatile oil prices have been in the last year alone. We've had between the high and low price, we have about a $30 difference. Part of that was directly related to Fukushima that we'll talk about today, but much more intense with respect to geopolitics in the Middle East, North Africa, and recently, as I mentioned, Iran, and the continuing uncertainty about global economic development, global debt crisis. So this is what the future's ahead for us, is continued uncertainty, continued volatility in prices, and most probably, on average, higher oil prices in particular. This is the slide that really sums up the investment needs for oil. This is an adaptation of the IEA's latest outlook, showing the declining rates of the mature oil fields and the need for new oil discovery, new oil development to meet rising demand. We're looking at probably 70 to maybe even 100 million barrels a day of new capacity that needs to be brought on stream over the next 30 years because of decline and to meet new demands. And most of that will be in Middle East and North Africa. The IEA says we need about $9 trillion of investment over those 20 to 30 years. And the reserves continue to be in the Middle East and North Africa, for the most part, 2/3 to 70%. So there's no way of getting around the Middle East continues to play a critical role because, A, that's where the oil and in some cases gas is located, and that's where the cheapest sources are. For most of the Middle East, you're talking $5 to $10 lifting cost. But when you look at oil sands in Canada, deep water, Gulf of Mexico, deep water Brazil, deep water Angola, those costs go up very sharply too, in the $60, $70 range. So it's not only investment stream, it's also taking that investment to where the lowest costs are. Again, mostly in the Middle East and North Africa. And as we move out the supply curve, you're talking $80 to $100 to produce those liquids from Canada's oil sands, and some of these new technologies require that kind of investment per barrel. Here's the resource nationalism aspect I really want to focus on. That's the national oil companies, the Saudi Aramcos, the National Iranian Oil Company, Iraqi National Company. Those are the companies that will be making these investments. And they have a very different business plan, a very different response to geopolitics than ExxonMobil, Shell, BP. I'm not bashing national oil companies, I'm just saying that they don't have the same kind of business plan. They don't have the same way of deciding what their investment should be. The best example would be Pemex in Mexico, where they have to rely on the parliament every year for their capital budget, and therefore many investments, I believe, in Mexico, such as deep water and developing gas, which would have been developed if it were just across the border, have not been made because of lack of investment funds. So just means that the challenge, the risk is that the investments needed to make that new capacity that I showed in an earlier chart may not happen at the pace we as consumers would like. The latest IEA outlook shows the shift in demand, in this case oil, dramatically moving eastward to China and India, with declines in all of the OECD regions, including, of course, Japan itself. Now, does that mean we should be less worried? Unfortunately, the answer is no, because even if 2/3 or maybe even 3/4 of oil transiting the Strait of Hormuz is going east, if oil is disrupted, the price will go through the roof and we'll all suffer from 150, maybe even higher oil prices. So the interdependency that was the principle of the foundation of the IEA and Japan's response to that through improved efficiency and emergency preparedness continues to be paramount. And we need to bring these other new economies into play, but clearly the risk of disruption through these choke points, some of which are shown here, and one that's not shown, very important to Eastern customers, would be the Strait of Malacca. So those choke points still remain vital to the energy security, and I think when they get asked, does that mean U.S. can start reducing its force presence in the Middle East? The answer, I believe, is no, even if our imports from the Middle East go to zero. It'll make it more politically difficult, but I think as the only real powers capable of projecting that force, I think our military presence will be in the Middle East even through the time when our imports are declining. The key to meeting disruptions is spare capacity, and that has declined since this rapid growth in demand in China and India, and remains relatively low at about 3.5 million barrels a day today, and that's what we would have to rely on if there were a disruption of Iranian oil. Most of that 3.5 is in Saudi Arabia. What would happen if there were a disruption? Clearly, this is coming to a head now with the new sanctions approved by U.S. Congress, the EU likely to impose a ban on Iranian oil imports, Japan and Korea are discussing other sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran. We'll be looking, and we are looking very closely at that. The EIA will be producing a report due to Congress by the end of February, assessing the impact on the global oil market if the Strait of Hormuz were disrupted. Thank you. So I think, we're looking at, even though I don't believe Iran will actually do anything to disrupt the strait, I think we are looking at a point of where there will be some volatility again later on this year as these sanctions start to bite. The good news, Canadian oil sands are truly a world-class resource. They have certainly the reserves are there. However, the cost is high. And as we've seen just recently, the politics of bringing that oil down to the U.S. has been caught up in the U.S. presidential elections, and the pipeline that was intended to bring about 800,000 barrels a day of that oil sand liquid into U.S. now has been stymied at least until after the election. But the resource is there, and I think we will see Canadian liquids production rise steadily as shown in this chart. So that's good news. The other part of the good news in North America is the shale resources that are now producing increasingly larger share of U.S. natural gas will continue to rise, and tight oil from those same shale source rocks will also rise. So there are even projections that North America as a group, that would be U.S., Canada, and Mexico, would be in balance in terms of net exports by 2020, 2025. That may be a bit optimistic, but not too much. I mean, the U.S. Gas and North American gas is now estimated to be going to be abundantly available for development, even to meet the highest demand numbers that are projected. So it's very likely that U.S. natural gas exports by LNG out of the Gulf of Mexico will become reality in the next 5 to 10 years. How large that will be still is to be determined. There's only been one permit approved so far. This is last year's EIA long-term outlook showing how important the role of shale gas is and will become in the U.S. It shows a slight net imports. The EIA released its 2012 outlook today at 9:30, so I wasn't able to get the slides. And what the new outlook says is U.S. gas production will exceed consumption, which means U.S. will be a net exporter of natural gas as soon as perhaps 2020, 25. That means lower prices. We've already seen much lower natural gas prices in the United States. Every year, EIA's price assumptions for natural gas has been lowered, and this year it's no exception. It'll be for at least the next 10 years, 10 to 15 years, EIA is projecting gas prices below $5 in MMBTU, which, as you know, is much, much lower than the LNG cost of gas to Japan. Depending on the scale of those natural gas exports, we could see an impact on the global gas market. It's still early to say, but most people believe at a minimum the natural gas contracts negotiated by Japanese and other Asian buyers will see the index adjusted so that prices are lower than the recent contracts have been in the $12 to $15. It's certainly very possible that future prices will be lower than that, and that we may not see the separation between oil and gas prices that we've seen here. Today's natural gas price in the United States at oil equivalent BTU terms is less than $20 a barrel. And as we all know, the crude oil price on New York Mercantile Exchange is about $100. So huge difference. I'm not predicting that will happen on a global basis, but clearly it's moving in that direction, because the global gas resources based on the shale rock are also abundant, and we'll see some development in places like China and Argentina and in Europe, Eastern Europe. So we're going to see certainly impact on global gas prices and global gas markets. It's still early to really say how much it will be, but I think it's in the right direction, which is just opposite of what I view for the oil market. A very brief word on U.S. energy policy. I know other speakers will talk more about that, but certainly the reaction here to this terrible tragedy in Fukushima has been to reiterate support for nuclear power by both President and Secretary Chu. There have been some studies done, and there are clearly some local concerns again being raised about certain plants. But I do think that on the policy side, there will be continued support for nuclear. The biggest issue, I think, here is more on the economics of nuclear, especially looking at natural gas base load prices at below $4 an MMBTU makes it very difficult to compete. So with that, Mr. Chairman, and ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Caruso. Mr. Ito.
I'm Shoichito from Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. Before starting my presentation, I'd like to make some remarks. This is my, I'm very happy to be back to one of my home grounds to see many of my friends here, and then so delighted to be sitting here with distinguished experts on the topic we are discussing. And this is actually the first return to Washington, D.C. after the 311 tragedy last year. So I'd like to express once again, as a Japanese, my sincere gratitude for Japanese friends, Americans, are provided both spiritual and physical support for the tragedy we had in Japan. And and I have felt such a big personal responsibility to make a follow-up on the topic I will show today, especially because when I was here in 2009 and 10, I once organized a very big event on the meaning of nuclear renaissance and non-proliferation for the U.S.-Japan alliance. So I knew I needed to make a follow-up for that very big agenda for the bilateral relationship. Having said that, though, all the remarks expressed in my presentation will be as wholly on my personal capacity. Let me start then. I'd like to raise 4 questions with particular keyword crisis in mind at first. It's sometimes important to go back to the original meaning of our words when we discuss some specific topics. Crisis in its original, original meaning, coming from classical Greek. Krisis means choice, judgment, decision. So this is something we have to pick up the best of all. Sometimes when we hear the word crisis, we get a kind of connotation, something being overwhelmed. But that's not all crisis actually means. Well, the first key question I'd like you to bear in mind to discuss together is, What are the physical constraints addressing Japan's policy options in the aftermath of 311 accident? Secondly, what are new challenges Japan is confronting as of today? Thirdly, what are Japan's responsibilities for international society? What Japan will decide will have significant impact upon the globe. Fourthly, what is the meaning of the US-Japan alliance in the area of energy security? This slide shows very low rate of Japan's energy self-sufficiency. Without nuclear power, the rate is as low as about 4%. It's unbelievably low. Compared with the United States, you have roughly 70% or so without nuclear power. Even with nuclear power, Japan's energy self-sufficiency is still as low as less than 20%. And this is why Japan has strived to increase the share of nuclear power over the years in its energy mix. Well, the left figure shows that the energy basic plans we had until the eve of 311 nuclear accident. In the left version, the cabinet adopted in June 2010, nuclear power was supposed to increase from 26 to over 50% by 2030. But today, virtually nobody believes this is feasible, and it can be the case. And after the C1 accident, we have had, of course, very serious and heated debate over what can be the best option for Japan's nuclear future. The revision is in the making under the jurisdiction of National Strategy Office, and the discussions are supposed to be completed by early summer, but there have remained many uncertainties as of today. Well, when we had the 311 earthquake, 36 out of 54 nuclear reactors were in operation. And right after the accident, earthquake, 10 reactors were shut down. And in Japan, well, just like elsewhere, nuclear power plants have to go through regular mandate inspection. And no single reactor has been restarted ever since we had a tragedy last year. In case the government cannot restart any plants in the coming months, the operating nuclear capacity will be just zero by the end of April. Even though some utilities are increasing the capacity of fired plants, if something serious happens, we are bound to face a very serious electricity shortage this summer and possibly in winter. Well, this is the estimate my office made recently by comparing the case, one with restart of nuclear plants, the other with nuclear power generation. In case Japan will restart no nuclear reactors at all, the amount of money we have to just buy LNG will be over 2 trillion yen, as you see in the slide. is huge, and it does have significant impact on the global gas and coal market. Well, this slide shows the changing trend in gas and oil prices. Well, here in the United States, you have the shale gas revolution. Gas is so cheap today. But in that case for Japan, Japan imports, Japan has no access to piped gas. All the natural gas comes from, in the form of LNG. And the prices are more than, 5 times as much as you pay here. And it's also, the price is also higher than European prices. Plus, in LNG market of Northeast Asia, natural gas pricing is linked to crude oil prices. When crude oil price is skyrocketing, natural gas, LNG price will follow that accordingly. Well, this is a slide comparing the geographical background of Japan. As everyone knows, Japan is such an island country. And unlike in Europe, our energy infrastructure is disconnected with our neighbors. Yes, Germany decided to phase out all nuclear power plants by 2022 or so, but they have capability to import electricity by way of transnational grid. Plus, their energy self-sufficiency is much higher in Japan. They have lots of domestic coal. Japan imports virtually all of its crude oil and LNG. Here we have some maps showing you all sorts of geopolitical flashpoints in the world. Briefly, partly explained by Mr. Guy Caruso already in the last presentation. What's going to happen in case we face a considerable blockade of Strait of Malacca? It will boost oil prices, and beyond that, as I already noted, that will once again increase natural gas prices as well. And we never know what's going to happen in South China Sea and East China Sea as well. All sorts of unexpected events may bring about chain effects. Who knows what's going to happen? This is a baseline we have to actually consider when we try to discuss energy security. And we are also facing all sorts of uncertainties over the Korean Peninsula. All kinds of possible crises will just please only speculators, not for the vast majority of nations across the nation. Well, I just wanted to focus upon the skyrocketing growth of Chinese energy demand before going back to nuclear questions. Well, these slides show you the rates of projected growth in Chinese energy demand. I don't have time to go into details, but I can give you some of the basic ideas. And CO2 emissions are also increasing so rapidly. And we have to reconsider how many policy options, alternatives, countermeasures we have if we really have to do something to stand against climate change for the future generation. And nuclear projects are mushrooming in number globally. Well, Japan's case is rather exceptional, just against the backdrop of the 311 accident last year. And that means Japan needs to reconsider its role and responsibility we should bear, not only for domestic issues, but also for international implications. And this is the field Washington and Tokyo can elaborate what we can do as the next step. Of course, we need more transparency, safety, etc., etc., etc. We learned lots of lessons from the huge accident last year. But these are the experiences we have to share globally. And I'd like to talk a bit about the implication of Japan's division of energy policy for the bilateral alliance. Japan and the United States agreed to develop new projects to enhance clean energy globally, and nuclear energy was placed as one of the main pillars already back in November 2009. And when we talk about nuclear issues, it's not just a matter of energy industry per se, nuclear market per se. It has lots of ramifications, implications for all sorts of issues addressing non-proliferation, combating against terrorism, etc., etc., etc. These are the set of the issues we have to discuss as I said. And from the standpoint of reinforcing U.S.-Japan alliance, working together in the field of nuclear security is something I personally believe there's no way back. We have to bear joint and inseparable responsibilities. Let me wrap up my presentation. First, there exists no panacea as such. We cannot expect 100% perfect energy as such. Japan as a country with such a low self-efficiency, we have to do everything to secure energy security, addressing security implications, environmental issues, economic rationality, etc., etc., etc. Secondly, Japan needs to reconsider international setting in which its policy options are limited in the foreseeable future. Thirdly, Japan's decision on energy will have multifarious and significant impact on the regional and global energy security. Fourthly, the answer cannot be a matter of likes and dislikes. It's always easy to say, I like that, I dislike that. The question is not that simple. But we have to be careful about what can be possible in the short, the mid, and the long terms. Fifthly, we must translate the current crisis into a stepping stone for the higher stage of U.S.-Japan alliance through the joint architecture of global energy security. Let me finish my presentation by citing my favorite, Martin Luther King Jr. When you are right, you cannot be too radical. When you are wrong, you cannot be too conservative. Thank you very much for your attention.
you very much, Mr. Ito. Mr. Spencer.
First of all, let me thank Professor Abe for this opportunity and USJI for the invitation to speak here with you all today. We heard a little bit earlier about EIA was coming out with their new estimates. I just got an email. It's interesting they determined that the U.S. would be a net exporter in natural gas within a decade. And that sort of sets up, let me also say, one of the things about coming last is that most of what I was going to cover has already been covered. On the positive side, one of the nice things about not doing a PowerPoint is that I'll try to introduce some different thoughts than what I was originally going to. But there might be a little bit of overlap, so bear with me a little bit, but I'll finish up in a different place than I think our previous speakers did. So the EIA has said that, in fact, the United States, at least under current projections, will end up to be a net exporter of natural gas, which is good news, I suppose. But there's two things, in my estimation, that can really prevent that. Both of them are government imposed. One is regulation, so that the federal government gets too involved and doesn't allow for the full exploitation of these really valuable resources. And two, we get nationalistic and protectionist, and we don't allow for the export of natural gas. Both of these things are beginning to emerge. The reason I point them out for this conversation is because that's the lens through which I think we need to view the issue of energy security and how I look at the issue of nuclear energy from an energy security perspective, both from the United States and what I would suggest for Japan. In essence, energy security, I believe, has often become a loaded term. It's become a term that people have used, and they use more and more as a justification to distort the marketplace. I would argue that the best way to achieve energy security is to take advantage of the marketplace, to get rid of discriminatory regulations, to get rid of subsidies, to actually let the market work. What this will do is allow investment to go towards the most promising technologies so that consumers and producers who really have the most on-the-ground interest in ensuring that we have access to energy are able to push our resources, our desires into the most promising things. And when government gets involved, it distorts that process. The government decides it wants X technology, so they take resources out of the private economy and put it towards X. The government decides for whatever reason it wants Y technology, it does that. They force consumers through mandates to purchase certain kinds of technologies. All of these things, I would suggest, yield less energy security, because when we come to a Fukushima or one of these chokeholds that we saw earlier, the energy economy is less nimble then, less able to react and respond to that, because it's been putting investments into these things that are less profitable or less promising. Then lastly, on that specific issue, I would argue it just simply does not work. We've been led to believe that if the government just invests enough money into solar, wind, nuclear, coal, gas, oil, whatever the technology is, that those things will come to fruition. I would suggest that the examples are far and few between where the government said, we want X technology to be commercially viable, we're going to build this program around it, and then that thing became commercially viable. In fact, the exact opposite is what happens. When the government decides it wants something to be successful, then the business models who are interested in those technologies start to play towards government policy. Instead of investing in those things that make you more efficient, more competitive, you invest in things that ensure that you perpetuate the subsidies, thus essentially retarding the evolution of that technology. So the larger lens through which I look at this issue is one that markets are the best source to achieving energy security. So coming back to Japan, and here's where we're going to get into a little overlap, so just bear with me. We know that Japan, prior to Fukushima, had 54 reactors operating. To give that some context, the U.S. has 104. Japan got 30% of its electricity from nuclear. The U.S., to give a little context, we get 20%. Japan wanted to increase that to 50%. They had 2 under construction when Fukushima happened, 12 planned. Interestingly, I think something that we can learn here in the United States, Japan was really marching toward having a workable used fuel, spent fuel nuclear waste policy, having built a reprocessing center. And it did this, as we heard, because Japan really doesn't have adequate national resources to support a modern economy. And that made sense for them. Then, of course, Fukushima happened. And the plants keep coming down and not being brought back on. Japan's looking at about 5 reactors, I believe, is the current count that's operating. And that's forcing imports of oil or of energy resources. And that's costing, we saw some estimates earlier, I won't go over that again, but billions and billions of dollars. The cost of shutting down all nuclear power plants has a huge economic impact. And then this is increasing the pressure on the Japanese recovery, not just the recovery that it has to that it's going through as being part of the modern industrialized economy that the whole world is, that much of the world is going through, but also, of course, responding to Fukushima. And that just makes things more difficult. So there have been different responses to it. Some have said we need to get rid of nuclear, or Japan needs to get rid of nuclear. Some have said let's try to figure out what's wrong and bring what we have back up on. There's been some movement towards renewable energies. And renewables, just unfortunately, where they are now, aren't going to cut it. Solar in Japan costs 10 times more than nuclear power in Japan. And if that's the cost differential, there's going to be major economic impact. Subsidizing it will not work. That will not drive the price down, as we just discussed. And if you don't have adequate energy and you don't have adequate affordable energy, industry starts to leave. Economic expansion stops happening. And that's a problem not just for Japan, but for the rest of the world. And ultimately, that's why I care, notwithstanding I want Japan to be successful, but the ramifications are far broader than that. So that sort of sets the context. I think that, though, moving forward, you got to think about what happened in Japan, why the Fukushima accident happened. Because I'll tell you, from my perspective, I know that a major earthquake happened, followed by not just a tsunami, but 7 waves. A serious natural event happened there. From my estimation, that's still not an excuse for a nuclear power plant not to be brought safely under control. And I think that it bears some serious looking at to understand what happened there. And it seems that every time a study gets done or someone comes out with their estimation of what's happened, you see the blame sort of falling in different areas. So it looks like it was largely a regulatory and oversight breakdown. And I just don't think that what happened in Fukushima had to happen. Seems to have been inadequate planning. There were reports that people had been warned that the tsunami walls were not adequate. We all know about the external power problems. Yes, having all of that, the water and the earthquake come, certainly will devastate your external power, but you have to have something else. We have to have something else in the United States. We all, if we're running nuclear power plants, need to have something else. The inadequate communications, there were inadequate communications at all levels, and this is something that is just, it's not good how it happened. You had inadequate communications, it seems, at the site level, between government and industry, between the regulator, government, and industry. This led to confusion and just not the ability to make the quick decisions that probably needed to be made. Inadequate information sharing, again, within the response teams, also with the public. I would argue that the United States, there were a couple of times where we didn't help matters much, when some of our government bureaucrats made some proclamations that probably weren't helpful. So internationally as well. There was inadequate training, how to respond to something like this. And what I think is one of the most important problems that were there was the incoherent chains of authority. Essentially, who's in charge? Who had the authority to make the decisions, the very tough decisions, to do what needed to be done to protect public health and safety at a moment's notice. And that's something that simply I believe, needs to change. Now, the good news is, and despite sort of this dourness, I think there is good news. Every one of these things are fixable. In fact, the United States, who is by no means perfect, and I'm not suggesting that, and I'm not trying to be preachy at all. We all get to where we are through our own experiences. But the United States had a similar experience with 3 Mile Island, where I would argue essentially all of the same problems you had, we had. Luckily, in the United States, the outcome was different, only by virtue of the nature of the accident, but we had the same problems, and we went through the process of fixing all these things. So there's no doubt in my mind that Japan can't fix all of these things as well, so we don't have to bear the burden of getting rid of the nuclear power plants that we've heard discussed a number of times here, that there is an opportunity not just to fix these problems, but to ensure that Japan doesn't have the economic impact, the negative one, of completely moving away from nuclear. And it seems that the government is recognizing this. Of course, there's going to be a huge public communication effort here, and the Japanese public needs to ultimately support nuclear power, and it's unclear right now if they're going to. But it was recently announced that the Japanese government's going to allow for the life extension of the nuclear power plants there to be licensed for an additional 20 years, which is a great thing and shows that the regulators there do see a future. So just a couple of quick words on what the impact of Fukushima has been. Those of us in the nuclear community or who look at nuclear energy issues, prior to Fukushima, we're keen to say something along these lines, that we can't allow an accident to happen anywhere, because an accident anywhere is essentially an accident everywhere. And if there should be an accident, the notion of a nuclear renaissance or the promise of one will simply stop in its tracks. And not only is that what most of us thought, but to think that if an accident were to occur in Japan, that accident that logic would have held up even stronger. And given the severity of that accident, I think a lot of us would have thought it's over. You know, there's just not going to be a nuclear renaissance anytime soon. And one of the big surprises for me as someone who looks at nuclear energy issues is that outside of a few examples, there hasn't been a whole lot of impact on the long-term plans of most countries building nuclear power plants. In fact, if there is a silver lining from the Fukushima accident, from a broad global perspective, is that I think a lot of folks, including in the US, sort of came to the conclusion that nuclear power is easy. That you just build a power plant and you get cheap electricity, it's clean and everything's great. And what Fukushima reminded us, and I think in a lot of these countries where they were just starting to build nuclear power plants, or they were going to have this massive expansion of nuclear power, that regulation matters. And when I say regulation, I just don't mean government oversight, but the way you build your nuclear industry, the way industry regulates itself, and the interactions between industry and government, and the interactions between the official regulator. All of those things matter, and I think that there's been a broad recognition that that's the case. And then lastly, I'd like to just put a quick, just explain quickly why I care about what happens in Japan from purely a U.S. perspective. Of course, I want Japan to be successful for, I think, reasons that are obvious. But one of the issues that I am really concerned about in the U.S. is that one of the things that we really depended on, that the U.S. nuclear industry really depended on, because we hadn't built a nuclear power plant in this country for a long time. And while we became world leaders in nuclear plant operations, really the best, what we weren't good at is the commercial industry of building new power plants and all that stuff. So those companies who were America's traditional nuclear companies, they built these strong relationships with Japanese companies. And it was this coupling that really, I think, positioned the United States and Japan to really take advantage of the opportunities that the nuclear renaissance was about to bring us. If Japan decides it's not going to build any new nuclear power plants, I think it's difficult for Japan then to maintain the credibility of those nuclear companies as exporters of new nuclear technology. And I think that takes away the symbiotic relationship that we were really at the threshold of developing as from a company standpoint and from a nation-to-nation standpoint. So I think for a whole lot of reasons, it's important that Japan get this right, and of course it is ultimately their decision. I would never say that I or the United States should tell Japan what to do. That's not what I'm here for. Japan needs to make the decision, and from a U.S. perspective, I hope it makes one that recognizes the importance of nuclear energy, and that I wish them nothing but the best in those endeavors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let's hear comments from two persons, Ms. Nakano to start with. Jane, go ahead.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I think I'd like to highlight some of the key themes that I cannot agree more on, and I will try to keep those to 3 points. First off, I guess as Japan tries to reformulate or readjust its energy policy, I guess the basic energy plan, Japan, like many other countries, or Japan, like any other country, needs to really balance multiple objectives, economic, environmental, and also geopolitical or national security issues. And however, as many of the presenters emphasized, Japan is an island country with very limited natural resources. So basically, Japan does not have the luxury that many other countries have in choosing from a wide range of policy options or even fuel sources, energy sources. So I mean, it's Japan faces a really sort of a layer of challenges here. As the future of the nuclear energy is intensely debated around the world, and including in Japan, let me just scratch quite a bit. It's important to have a very realistic range of pathways where Japan wants to go from here. I know, policies being revised, and there are many sensible options and thoughts on the table. And one of the things we all have to remember is that the transformation of energy system requires a large investment. It also takes many years, if not a decade or two. But then also it has an enormous impact on macroeconomic issues, employment, consumption, etc. So it's important that a policy decision is not in reaction to something. It has to be a sustainable vision of where the public wants to take its country and its next generations to. Having said that, I think ultimately, Japanese people, it's important for them to make up their own mind. But there are many things that I think the U.S. and the rest of the world would like to share with Japan, and it's a really good chance for many of us to have the debates or the discussions like what we're having today. And related to that is, I guess another thing to remember is the resource availabilities are different from the technology viability. These are two different stories. As Jack sort of highlighted, for example, renewable energies are mostly indigenous, wind, solar, and it does have very low carbon impact. Aside from, I think still the jury is a bit out when we look at the impact on the total ecological sort of life cycle, and the ecological matter. But having said that, I think it's mostly indigenous, low carbon. But it's the technology is not there yet. It's not mature yet. It's still very expensive. So so we need to have a very realistic expectations for the role that the renewable energy may play. I happen to think that renewable is an important part of the country's energy mix. It's nothing to be taken lightly. It's important. However, we need to be very realistic. For example, as Japan looks at the role of renewable in sort of a transformation scenario, we need to keep in mind that the pace of the renewable market expansion globally, and perhaps, and then also the size of the market, eventual market, will likely be determined by not so much, well, I mean, Japan does have very strong R&D base, but perhaps by countries with even more robust manufacturing capacity with a large domestic market, such as China. So to some extent, it's very tricky to put sort of eggs in one basket where you don't really control the pace or the size of the eventual market, which will, of course, help any country benefit once the price of these renewable technologies come down to benefit the wider, larger segment of the global community. So that's, and then lastly, the US and Japan, as Shoichi has highlighted, has a history of deep and robust cooperation. And it's not just in commercial arena, but also in nuclear energy research and development. And the current challenge, I believe, can be and must be really turning into an opportunity that could take the US-Japan relationship, but then also the sort of the state of nuclear energy, whether in decommissioning of, say, Fukushima Daiichi, to the next level. And I think we're all very capable, and so I look forward to more of opportunities, not just a challenge ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Professor Tago.
Thank you. I'm Atsushi Tago from Kobe University. Probably I'm the one freezing out here. I'm from San Diego, enjoying 60 degrees over there, but feeling importance of energy due to that. I'm a specialist of national security, focusing on the alliance and the correlates of coalitions of the willing, and also the nuclear non-proliferation. I honestly learning from here and do not know about the energy policy per se, but I can probably comment on the perspectives of the national security and geopolitical point of view. And I want to make a quick 3 or 4 points. But we have to make, well, everybody knows that Japan is highly dependent on the oil and gases these days. I was surprised to see their trade deficit. I'm not good in their counting numbers, so you know the numbers, but I'm probably about we have a huge amount of the dependence on the oil and gases. And given that, if we continue those, probably we have to think of 3 things from which I would say, well, first of all, that Japan is the dependent, and the other country, rising country, China, is also very resource important country, and we obviously has a tension over the energy, obtaining energy from the outside of country. And indeed, those competition may not be as peaceful as we really wish. Indeed, the Senkaku is the conflict over territory, but it's more on the fight over energy, I think. Given that, to attain the secure regional stability in the East Asia, obviously we need to think of the energy policy in terms of the US-Japan alliance connections. We have to, well, obviously there's a development in high political officials debate, but probably rather than talking about only Okinawa, we need discussions over the energy policy and the US-Japan dialogues. Well, if I make this kind of comment in Tokyo, maybe people may criticize me by saying, like, oh, you don't think Okinawa is important? No, it's not important. I think it's important, but we cannot stick to that kind of one aspect of the alliance tie. That's one thing. And the second is that it's also connected to the US-Japan alliance, but Japan actually really needs a contingency plan for supporting the US policy in the Middle East. Well, probably naval self-defense has a sort of plan, but we have a capability of helping the US, especially when something happens in the Strait of Hormuz. But probably we don't have a legal setting to do that. Well, I'm talking about the coalition of willing, that could happen in protecting the Strait of Malacca. Some people may think it's out of the question. Well, I do not think so. Well, Japan really needs to help the U.S. and support the U.S. policy to secure our importing line of the energy from the Middle East. And in that case, we really cannot be a free rider on those things. That's strongly I feel that way, and I really hope that the government think that way. But given the condition of this DPJ government, I can be, I'm really pessimistic. But we really need to think that way and try to do that. And thirdly, I'm a scholar advocating the Democratic Alliance in Pacific. Japan-Australians relations are very important too. I think we really need to make sort of alliance, not like a US-Japan alliance, but that could be very good for us and good for the US because strong Japan is probably interest of yours. I really hope that the US thinks that's the way and probably help us in maintaining the good relation with Australia. Well, in short, that probably what I'm saying is that Japan needs a serious, realistic reaction under these conditions, and with those in mind, I think the vigorous public debate is needed, but again, I'm a bit pessimistic about this government, but we really hope that we are capable of doing a good debate and get to some conclusion, the policy decisions of which we really need sooner, because we always discuss a lot and do not decide, so that's another bad thing of Japanese. Well, that's probably what I can say from my perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Tago. When I was looking at the list of participants, there are a lot of specialists on energy also. So let's open up. And I have a small but important suggestion. We put the microphone over there, and I need your name, and if you wish, not if you wish, and your organization, if you belong somewhere. And of course, we need a good question and challenging question. Go right ahead. No, ladies first. Thank you very much.
My name is Isabel Marotkovsky, and I'm from the Project 2049 Institute. Thank you very much for your presentations today. We've heard a lot today about how Japan has this close relationship, this symbiotic relationship even, with the US with regards to nuclear cooperation. And I was first of all wondering what potential there is for this relationship to continue with nuclear, but possibly even exceed into renewable. Recently, we had a couple Diet members in town. We took them to the Pentagon. And the first thing one of them mentioned was, oh my gosh, look at all these solar power plants. What's going on over here? What's happening? And little do they know, but in the US, the Department of Defense is leading, in some instances, the renewable revolution. And I'd like to know what potential there is for cooperation, maybe between the Ministry of Defense in Japan and the Department of Defense here in the US for renewable energies. Thank you.
Yes, you
How are you orders? We answer one by one?
no,
Or take other questions?
no, just wait. Let's go couple of questions one by one. And then, depending upon how we are doing, I will think about different way. Just you and until the third person. Just a minute,
Okay.
one by one. Could you answer, and
Okay.
also Mr. Spencer?
Okay, let's get as many questions as possible. My answer will be brief. I think the cooperation of our renewable development is very significant because both Washington and Tokyo share the same interests in reducing oil dependency. It has both economic and political implications, other than just developing clean energy technologies per se.
I mean, I would argue that there's potential there, but it depends on what technology you're talking about. And I think the Department of Defense is a good example. I mentioned that that, I'll just say I'm skeptical of the U.S. government getting involved in energy technology development for commercial reasons. One of the areas where the U.S., or any government, but the U.S. in particular, does have a legitimate role to play in energy development is for military purposes. The question, though, then becomes, to what end is that energy development? One of my criticisms of the current approach in the administration is that it's through mandates. So if the Department of Defense is developing an energy technology in order to meet some sort of mandate, then you're probably not developing the most credible, legitimate, commercial, the best technologies. If, however, the military has determined that it needs an energy technology developed in order to enhance its capabilities, to fulfill its missions better, nuclear energy is a good example of where that happened, actually, then I think there is ample opportunity. But if you're using the military as a proxy for government development of commercial applications, then I think you run into the same problem. You will end up forcing technologies onto the public that it can neither afford nor really wants.
Any additional?
The only thing I would add is that the IEA, as a multilateral organization, does have an energy technology program, which Japan and the U.S. are very active in. And I think the most beneficial use of that is in the basic technology, not so much as, I'd agree with Jack on the commercialization side.
Just a very brief comment. I think that right now the U.S. and Japanese governments do have a microgrid demonstration in Hawaii and Okinawa. So not necessarily R&D or innovation stage, but there are many different steps along the way that U.S. and Japan can cooperate using some of the U.S. or Japanese, I guess, public facilities, I think.
Thank you. Masaki Takahashi. I'm with the World Bank. Energy security is a complicated issue, so I have several questions, but coal, nuclear, renewables, but Mr. Abe will not allow me to make many questions at a time. So I will keep it one at a time. There is a long queue. So I will first round, I will concentrate on the natural gas. We are hearing from Mr. Crusoe and Mr. Spencer, for other speakers, commentators, that saying that the U.S. will be the net exporter, and in a decade. And I'm also attended APEC. Transport and Energy Ministerial Conference and the Roundtable Security, Energy Security Roundtable in September in San Francisco. Dr. Chu chaired the whole Transport Energy Ministerial meetings. And at that meeting also the natural gas is the largest issues to be discussed. And I was thinking, net export, where to export? Of course, there are three markets, US, Europe, and Asian Pacific. And from the US, you can export to anywhere, but we are also hearing the price from Mr. Ito and Mr. Crusoe, $3, $4 per million BTU here, and in Japan, 12 more than that, dollars per million BTU. Probably in Europe, $7, $8 per million BTU. Of course, those are not comparable numbers to export to Japan, for example, liquefaction, transport, regasification. Cost need to be added, but at the APEC conference, somebody told me that even adding these costs at the point of using in Japan, with a $3, $4 per million BTU, in Japan it will be it could be $7, $8 per million BTU compared to 11, 12. So it's still much cheaper, reasonable. In Europe, maybe it's a comparable number than $7, $8. And for other places like Latin America, it's a still small market. So mainly, I guess, the export in quantity and price-wise, Asia is the most reasonable exporting place to think about. And not probably only Japan. China, India is increasing LNG import. And Mr. Spencer mentioned about some barriers, some constraints about the export, some regulations, any issues. I didn't catch all of them, but if we can hear these barriers in the energy security in the US itself, what would be needed to be solved? I'm hearing or looking at, sorry about me, just to make a ground of questions, to make the export possible to Japan or the Asian market. What would be the constraint? What need to be solved? Those are the questions. For example, in Japan, I'm sorry. In the World Bank, we are discussing about the LNG investment in Philippines, in Southeast Asian countries. So not only Japan, but the Asian market. What would be the constraints or the issues need to be solved for that?
I'll start. I think one, Takahashi-san, you mentioned the cost, and that's number one, keeping costs low in developing these shale gas resources. Right now, companies have been able to, through a learning curve, bring costs down to below $4 in many cases. I think costs probably would need to be in the $4 to $5 range at the point where we price it at Henry Hub. Then you're going to add, obviously, liquefaction cost and some profit there for the companies, plus transportation. So I do think to make it competitive in Europe especially, we're going to need to see costs remain relatively low if you're going to get any significant volume at all. And perhaps maybe as important is the potential regulatory constraints that Jack alluded to. I think we're now beginning to see some U.S. politicians saying, why should we be exporting our own natural resources? We should keep it home. Plus the other side of that, which is as we develop more gas, based on most economic models, it means that the price will go up, and EIA has recently completed a study which says that depending on the volume, you would get some upward pressure on price. So those are the two constraints. I think the ability to keep the costs low in producing that shale gas and getting it to the LNG facilities, plus this regulatory environment, which could very well be a constraint to large volumes. Jack, did you want to?
I'll add two other things. One, we need the infrastructure to do it. And you have a same set of regulatory problems potentially. You know, a few years ago, before we had $3 natural gas, we were talking about importing liquid natural gas. And there was all kinds of controversy about building these LNG import facilities. Well, you need the same things, just turn them around and send it out. And I would imagine you'll have that same sort of fighting against those. And then another one, and this comes to the pricing and something I'm interested in, as you might have noticed, the market impacts of this stuff and the impacts of government intervention. you have on Capitol Hill a movement to subsidize natural gas vehicles. And if you subsidize natural gas vehicles, you create an additional upward price pressure on the natural level of natural gas prices. So those are all things that are potential barriers to fully developing the export market.
Anything to add?
I'm John Easton with Edison Electric Institute. Dr. Abe, if I may, 3 short questions, one for each panelist. For Guy Caruso, Guy, on your first slide at the last bullet, you talked about unconventional resources buying some time to get to, I think you said, new energy sources. By that, do you mean oil and gas, or do you mean such things as renewables, hydrogen, fusion, et cetera? For Mr. Ito, you talked about the possibility of no nuclear capacity by April. Do you or any of the panelists see anything in the terms of Japanese public policy that might change that might ameliorate that? Jack Spencer, you talked about relying on the marketplace for energy security. It seems to me that predicates a free and open marketplace, and I wonder, with lots of buyers and sellers and open, transparent, educated, et cetera, whether we really have that in oil markets where 15 of the top 20 are national oil companies who have different agendas, and many of whom belong to OPEC, which has perhaps restrictive supply provisions. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I do mean that these unconventional sources, both like gas and the tight oil, are going to, I believe, give us the opportunity to make a smoother transition to away from fossil fuels than the aspirational goals that were part of the Obama campaign in '08 and continued for a while now seem to be a little bit more realistic with respect to the time frame. But we've been saying both at EIA when I was there and now at CSIS that we're really talking about a need for decades of either transition or whatever term you want to use. And I do think this now provides us with that opportunity. Hopefully, the political system will facilitate that and not impede it.
With regard to the question about the possibility of restarting nuclear reactor in Japan, wow, there are too many uncertainties, and this is such a weapon-grade question, bombarded upon me. Well, I have to answer just as a political scientist rather than energy expert. This is real politics. As a matter of fact, the Japanese government has not yet presented a clear-cut answer on that. They say that as far as safety is guaranteed, they do admit the necessity of restarting nuclear reactors. Having said that, they are debating how they can define perfect safety as such. And politics matters a lot. DPJ, as you know, is not as strong as it can be the case. So anything can happen. I do hope that they can make a very rational decision, but it has remained a hope as such. That means that I'm not saying there will be no hope. It can be yes, it can be no. No one can answer the question at this moment.
No, you're right. There are a lot of government actors in the global petroleum market. I think, though, they still have to operate, at least they're still influenced by market pressures. But either way, I think that from a U.S. perspective, we are best served by maximizing our access to diverse resources. And should some other player decide, for whatever reason, to cut off the spigot, a market and private actors acting in a free market are better able to respond to such an occurrence. So, for example, I think that a lot of people talk about an all of the above approach to energy. I think that we should maximize our access to all of the above, not make sure that we have a predetermined mix of energy that includes everything, but that should whatever happen occur, that we're most able to access that, everything. In the case of the oil marketplace, I would argue that the best way to achieve our energy security through that mechanism is by making sure we maximize our access to both domestic and international resources. So if a single supplier in the global marketplace decides to turn off the spigot, we have ANWR, we have our offshore, we have Excel, we have all of these things, all of these resources that we're denying our own access to. That in turn, and this is an important part, increases the utility of a foreign hostile player to cut off the spigot because the impact is greater. So you minimize their impact by maximizing our resources, and then by minimizing their impact, you undermine the utility of even turning anything off to begin with. So it all works together. And I would argue if a market approach is the best way to achieve energy security in a perfect world, in a perfect market, that the way to get closer to that is not to operate in an anti-market way because someone else is operating in an anti-market way.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sam Lederer with FEPC. I have one comment and one question. Mr. Spencer, your argument that the marketplace would lead to greater energy security. When I think about that and what we heard from Mr. Caruso about the cheapest resources being in the Middle East, if the marketplace was allowed to decide, then purchasing would come from the Middle East, which is the most unstable region, or one of the most unstable regions in the world. And so how would that add to energy security? I don't really understand that argument. The second question for our Japanese commentators, and I think Mr. Ito's analysis was spot on, that the perspective about energy policy, the discussion needs to be in a broader context of Japanese leadership on nonproliferation, R&D leadership, things like that. And I'm sure those discussions are happening within the government. But how do you get that discussion down to the public level? Because I think the public is really concerned only about safety right now and confidence in the government to ensure their safety. So how do you translate that top-level discussion down to the public level? Thank you.
I guess I'll go, since the first one came to me. That argument assumes that price is the only determining factor in a marketplace, and it just isn't. If you're a supplier of energy, you want to be able to provide your consumers with whatever it is that they want in order for you to make money. And if you, as the provider of energy, think that supplies coming from the Middle East aren't secure, then you're going to diversify your supply base so you're not dependent on them to provide that service. Now, I would argue that the question is not whether do we deny ourselves access to Middle Eastern oil for whatever reason, but rather are we dependent on that access? And I would suggest that the way to minimize that dependence is, not to beat a dead horse, but to maximize your resources, maximize your suppliers, not just from an oil standpoint, but from an energy a broad energy standpoint. That's why I'm so excited about nuclear. That's why I think nuclear has a broad future. We've just scratched the surface with what nuclear energy can do. It's an electricity supplier. We have a limited amount of a single technology essentially that's out there. Nuclear energy comes in all different shapes and sizes and can be brought to bear throughout the economy for all of our energy needs. Maximizing that resource really that's how you increase energy security, because once you have something like that, then what good does Saudi or some other country have to cut you off? It just will upset everyone, and they'll switch to something else. So it's not about denying access, it's about maximizing your supplier base.
Mr. Ito?
Okay. Thank you very much for an excellent question. My direct answer to your question is that's why the conference as such we have today means a lot. You're right, Japanese nation is now involved again. I think it's understandable. If you have such a big accident domestically, if you see it, if your friends are involved in a way or another, it can be understandable, but it's very important to replace what we have in Japan in international context. So all we can do as experts is to promote, understanding of objectiveness, economic rationality, geopolitical, understanding, etc., etc., etc. And Japan cannot decide its energy policy only in domestic context. But this is something we have to make extra effort to do that. Thank you.
Well, I think I can make 2 comments. In fact, if you go to the Kono Taro's website, Kono Taro is probably famous here. He's trying to increase sort of the public debate. So there's such a movement. But as a matter of fact, I really wanted to say the mass media is, it's their sort of the responsibility advocating a healthy public debate rather than just, trying to find some governmental failure of concealing the information and such and such. So it's really, really important that I know there are some medias here and try to play their role as we expect.
I am very appreciating your comments because I am very encouraged. My name is Kiyoshi Yamauchi. I am operating the nuclear business of Mitsubishi Heavy Industry based in US. And I have 3 questions or maybe commitments. One is I'm living with my wife DC, enjoying 2 years. And our favorite TV program is Television Japan and NHK World, sorry for that. But every day, the news coming from, it seems, government, our colleagues lose confidence, or just the news of contamination. No discussion about energy security. And I think especially the public opinion in Japan should be more matured. So I would like to ask, is there any good means to get their opinion matured? Maybe some influence from US is definitely needed in this case. And the second one is, as you know, in the US, Hitachi-san, Toshiba-san, and Mitsubishi are working for the new build. And we are, of course, competitors, but there should be no single winner. Everyone be needed, every player be needed. And we bring our technology from Japan or components, but we will use the labors here, construction company, supply chain. So it is something like a US-Japan big project. And I think this success is also good for the US, but also a good message to Japan. So please support these activities. And the third one is still, as a nuclear supplier, we should have a lesson that Japan is, anytime a big disaster, natural disaster will be coming. So I think from now on, we cannot say it's due to the beyond design basis. And we, industry, do our best. Thank you.
Yes. Mr. Ito, I think Ito and Professor Tago on the first point.
Well, first of all, I'm not expert. I'm not a natural scientist, so I'm not in a position to comment on the impact of contamination. Having said that, though, I think it's really important to put more information about what happened elsewhere internationally, to have objective judgment of what we have in Japan. That's all what I can say. And with regard to the third point, I think you're right that what United States and Japan can do together will be just beyond the nuclear market here and there. And I have recently visited South Korea and talked with Korean experts on nuclear energy. And one of the comments I had over there was really striking. They are more concerned about possible impact of nuclear expansion in China than they saw back in Japan. Yes, China is presenting such a big, expanding nuclear market. So there can be a competition. At the same time, we have to make sure they will have the best safety-oriented nuclear reactor down the road in a way or another. As I showed in my slides, it is quite inevitable, impossible to turn the trend back. And yes, we are concerned about too rapid a pace of nuclear expansion in China. Without increased nuclear capacity over there, it will affect energy markets, including natural gas market as well. So, there's a pace over there we can work together, and I think Chinese will also appreciate that.
Okay, then just the, yes, the quick comments, I guess, on this maturity question, is it? Yes. I wish I had, I mean, I think there's a range of, I suppose, menu, but I'm afraid I feel like it's not, there's no quick solution. But I think I'm more and more encouraged that whenever I go to Japan for work, there seems to be sort of bigger range of think tanks in Japan. I think it's no longer sort of the ministries and the media and perhaps industry. There's more room for people that do bring different perspectives or even different academic backgrounds. Some people study in Europe, in the US and such. And I think it might be a gradual step, but I think that's definitely leading countries, very high literacy, very capable countries as Japan, sort of trying to keep it more robust in that field. And perhaps the civil society, it's never, I think that's one ingredient of how sophisticated and mature a country or a society is. But it's interesting, I think your comments are extremely sensible, very important. I think there needs to be more efforts to convey to the public that energy security, but then also safe operation of these facilities like nuclear are common goods. And really the safety discussions in Japan has direct relevance to safety discussions in, for example, China, as Shoichi just said. When Japanese public are concerned about the yellow sounds, coming from, if yellow sounds come, then of course, if accident happens there, then it come, so, maybe in a way, maybe it's not the most sophisticated analogy, but you also have to connect different dots to make sure that people at different levels or the different interests or sectors can associate with some of the challenges we all face in making sure that people understand their common goods. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Patrick Garr, and I'm actually with the USJI. And my question is actually in regards to what Mr. Spencer was commenting on. Mr. Spencer, through your discussion, you talked a lot about free market, and I think that's a very interesting point because it sparks a lot of discussion with energy security. And I wanted to touch more based on the fact of regulation where you mentioned, and I wanted to open it up to more of the panel, the fact, because I think it's a very important question to ask ourselves what role government should have in providing safety measures in energy security, particularly at like the power plants and oil drilling. And as it wasn't not just with the last Fukushima disaster, but also with the BP oil spill that happened in the Gulf. I think securing oil enrichment is very important, as well as like nuclear power plants. So with your comments about like less regulation is better with the market, I also want to have like perhaps everyone comment on like where they feel the government should take an active role in regulating energy resources and whether there should be more of a role or less of a role, and if actually free market is the better way to go and if the market can actually regulate itself. Thank you very much.
To your surprise, probably, I think there should be less regulation, and I think that the market will work. But I'll give you a little bit more. From a gas, I think that the BP oil spill was, aside, just put it in sort of the academic world, as a case study to look at. I think it demonstrates specifically the flaw of government-funded, government-sponsored liability. There you have a situation where everyone pays into a liability fund, and if something goes bad, that fund pays for the problems. It's a flawed socialist sort of system. I think in the case of BP, and this is, I did and Heritage did a lot of work on what's the free market response to that. And I think that there is a very good market response to that. If you want to engage in a offshore drilling activity, a third-party risk assessor should determine what the liability is associated with that. Then the role of government should be to ensure that you have adequate liability coverage to cover that activity and then you should be permitted to go do it. That then creates a situation where you are responsible for your activity. The government's not subsidizing it. You're not socializing the risk. You get the fruits of your labor. You're also incentivized to promote safety. That private sector promotion of safety is a great, it works. And I think that there's a lot to learn from the nuclear industry, even though nuclear has Price-Anderson, which that's a whole discussion in and of itself. And from a free market perspective, I support Price-Anderson, and if anyone wants to know why, we can talk about that later. But I think that what you have in the nuclear industry is after you learned from 3 Mile Island, you had this a new approach to regulation. When I say regulation, it's not just government-imposed regulation. You had not just a nuclear regulatory commission who sort of changed how it does things, but you had the introduction of INPO, which is a private sector regulatory agency. You had the way the plants are operated at a plant level and utility level. And the way these things all interact is what I think has made nuclear energy in the United States so safe. And applying those principles more broadly, I think could yield a lot of benefit in the U.S. offshore drilling or oil industry and in Japan, I would argue. So I think there's a ton to learn from private sector, market-based liability, and in that system, the role of the government is to set the guidelines and make sure you follow them, essentially.
I think that's an excellent question. As we now are hopefully on the cusp of really ramping up this shale gas, and that is that there are states such as Pennsylvania, New York, and maybe even Ohio who will now be experiencing huge rush of new business, and it's important that those states have strengthened regulatory bodies and regulatory staff, because otherwise I think the potential for the risk of something going wrong and then causing the whole development of this abundant resource to slow down it's actually in the industry's interest too that these states have strengthened. I don't think we need much more in terms of federal, but certainly some of these states who are now developing the shale gas benefit from stronger regulatory standards, as Jack says, as well as the staff that can enforce and monitor that.
Steve Mitnick, Build Energy America. And my question is about renewables in Japan. It seems, as I observe, being an American energy expert, that there's many Japanese who hold out the hope that going to near zero in nuclear can be made up in some way, to some extent, or largely, by wind and solar power development in Japan. And I've worked in the US wind industry quite vigorously, but from the standpoint of American energy experts, it's almost, well, it's not credible. If one looks at Japan being a island nation, not large, not having vast amounts of flat area as we might have, say, in the Midwest in the United States, or in the desert areas in the Southwest, it's not credible that Japan could have more than an insignificant amount of its contribution from energy sources that require such vast amounts of land versus nuclear power, for example, which, if anything, it's one of its greatest strengths is the intensity of how much energy is produced in so small a space. It almost seems as if there's no wonder that Japan quickly became a leader internationally in nuclear technology. So I wonder why there isn't more discussion in Japan about, mature discussion about the true potential of wind and solar in Japan.
I think your question brings us back to one of my conclusions I shall already we have to, make sure we are talking about short-term, mid-term, or long-term. As a matter of fact, virtually nobody is against, a dramatic increases in renewables. But the question is, given the fact that renewables account only about 1% of power generation as of today, can we increase that 1% to up to 10 or 20% overnight in a week or in a couple of years? I don't think my mathematics cannot give you a very opportunistic answer. That is the story. So in the long run, yes, you are right. But this year, the debate over the prospective expansion of renewables must be distinguished from what we can do this year, next year, or in a decade.
I'm looking behind, perhaps there's somebody else, but my name is Kikuchi, and I work with Washington Research and Analysis, a small consulting firm. I used to be with the World Bank for 31 years. My question is to Mr. Spencer, Mr. Caruso, Mr. Tago, Professor Tago. I'd like to follow up on what the gentleman said. As you know, Japan is the size of California and 3 times more population, and yet it had 54 nuclear reactors operating a while ago, and they were going to build another 14 on schedule until this recent disaster. Now, the question is if, as Mr. Spencer says, nuclear power has so much options and so forth, why aren't there any nuclear power plants under construction to the level of Japan within the United States? Perhaps the population is more mature than Japan, so they have some resistance against nuclear power plants. But if the free market should take place and Japan is to be the US ally, then the solution would be for United States to build more nuclear power plants, free the use of oil and gas, and make Japan use it. How is that as a possibility? Thank you.
I'm for it. No, I think that there's so many things in that question. First of all, this notion that natural gas is cheap and it's going to be cheap forever today is not the first time people have thought that a certain resource was going to be cheap. So we don't know what the future price of any of this stuff is going to be. Given that, I think that one of the real strong attributes of nuclear power is that you sort of know what it's going to cost over time. And it very well may be the case that building more nuclear power frees up other natural resources for exports. If that's what the market dictates, I'm for it. But to your question, why aren't we building them here? And this goes to my Price-Anderson answer, actually. I think the government has so screwed up the nuclear energy industry in the United States that it's impossible for anyone to put forth any kind of serious investment without it being so risky, given our past experience, that you need government subsidies to support it. And when you're dependent on government subsidies, you can't build any sort of long-term sustainable business model. And without a long-term sustainable business model, when you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar facility, you're simply not going to build it. Thus, you have people who, like me, who are nuclear energy policy guys who try to figure that out and try to look at what those problems and barriers are. I think that it's three big ones, but that we just don't address. We have a regulatory system in the United States that A, makes it too difficult to get a plant permitted, and B, you can only get one kind of technology. The lack of regulatory support for alternative technologies is a huge market barrier. So the thought of SMRs is just a pipe dream as far as I'm concerned, unless you have a regulatory institution that can support it. We have in the nuclear, so we turn to subsidies. So this whole business model is built around subsidies, which I think is flawed. But most importantly of all, is we have an industry with nuclear power. The further it moves away from government control and regulation, the more successful it becomes. Nuclear power plants didn't become these money-making, efficient, energy-producing machines until we deregulated the utilities. It wasn't until that you had this growth in nuclear power. We didn't have private enrichment companies popping up around the United States until you privatize enrichment, for example. You go down the line of nuclear power, the market works. The one thing that remains completely a government function is nuclear waste, and that is completely dysfunctional, and that's the key to the future of nuclear power. We need to privatize waste management. Until you do, in my estimation, you won't have a nuclear renaissance. That's why I think we're not building enough nuclear power plants.
Well, let me add, in addition to these regulatory impediments, I think when I was at EIA, we had, for year after year, no grassroots new nuclear power plants in our forecast. And that hasn't changed much except for the responses to the loan guarantee. And the reason was the capital costs were so much higher than baseload coal plants. It wasn't even gas, because then gas prices weren't expected to be that low. So we would get complaints from the Nuclear Energy Institute and the nuclear program from within DOE that we were biased against nuclear. Well, the problem was that the numbers just didn't add up. And that time we were using $2,000 a kilowatt for capital cost. I'm looking at the latest EIA assumptions now and others, and that number's up to something like 4,500, 5,000. So I don't know about the point about the nuclear costs haven't gone up. I think the capital costs have, and so I think it's true. There's been regulatory impediments in the waste programs. That there's been a disaster, but waste storage, but the economics is still the main negative. Jane, I don't know. You're a nuclear expert. I
don't think it was a question for me in a way.
Oh.
Yeah, so.
I guess just quickly, I guess, the price of, the role that having a pricing, the price of the carbon may affect, but then I'm not sure to what degree. I mean, different society has different way of responding, and of course, it could be in the form of cap and trade, could be in the form of carbon tax, but there is one sort of variable there down the road.
Thank you.
Can I just say one quick thing? My approach doesn't guarantee that you build more reactors. So the economics matter. My approach simply allows nuclear energy to have an opportunity to compete.
Very good point.
Hi, thank you. My name is Audrey Tauscher. I'm an independent energy and environment consultant. I appreciate the comments of the panel and Mr. Ito and Jack's comments about how economics plays into the role of nuclear energy, and if Japan has to get rid of all its nuclear plants, the cost to the country. One issue that hasn't been mentioned at all is climate change, and the costs of climate change and carbon, excess cost for emitting carbon is going to be very high for Japan, and that has a ripple effect on all the other countries that do business on Japan. Could any of you comment on climate change and how that falls into the future of nuclear? I think that they come together, they play. Climate change supports nuclear power. Thank you.
Maybe I went through my presentation quickly. I actually had a slide on CO2 emissions. Yes, you are perfectly right. Without nuclear power, we don't have other alternative to reduce CO2 to a drastic degrees. So what Japan will decide at this moment will have a significant impact upon global climate change discussions.
Yeah. Well, probably I should have mentioned on this, but Japan had their commitment to this problem by hosting the Kyoto Protocol's regime, and it's pretty important that we keep that commitment in the system. But the trouble is that will connect to the increasing the nuclear. Well, it should be a sort of the debate, but I don't see the healthy debate on that either. Probably many people or there's somebody thinking of that, but it's not getting down to the public debate. So it should be done as some of the questions made.
Thank you very much. 12 o'clock came, and I thank you very much for your participation. Just one point I just would like to mention. As part of my memory, in '96, the Singapore civil servants, quite high civil servants, high-level civil servants, was asked by me, what would you like to show me on behalf of Japan, being Singaporean? What would you like to teach me? Was my question to him. And he thought I was asking him to take me to old man's house. And I said, no, I'm not talking about that. I don't want to see your old man. I would like to see your idea, what you would like to show me for Japanese to see. Then he understood finally. He took me to the city of Malacca. He forced me to stay overnight in Malacca. And we stayed in a very nice little hotel with binoculars. From the window, what I saw was fantastic scenery. The things which Malacca, on Malacca River or Malacca Strait moves right hand, okay, I'm on the top of Malacca Hill, and I'm looking at the strait. The things going to the east, the ship is huge. But the ships which moves to the left-hand side, it means west. In fact, it's east. I'm talking about Bakan. Visiting Japan and Korea and China, those ships, you don't see the ships. Almost sunk because it's fully laden. That's why. But the difference between fully laden and empty ships, and I think that's the real scenery of energy benefits and energy crisis. And what did he give to me before leaving Malacca? This Singaporean guy said, if I made a mistake and put the bomb into the strait, then the ships will have to go to Lombok in Indonesia. So he gave me the sea route, routing of Lombok to go through to China, Japan, and Korea. That's what I remember right now. Anyway, thank you very much for your participation, and thank them for a nice presentation and comment. Thank you very much.
It was fun. Yeah.